Hello everybody, this is a response to the video, Needs and Challenges of a Disaster. As survivors and communities go through the difficult phases of a disaster crisis, the needs and challenges change. This is an overview of the resources needed in each phase as well as the challenges in these phases of disaster recovery. So there are 6 phases whenever we're talking about disaster and disaster recovery. So in the pre-disaster phase, this is the period before the disaster. In a situation such as a hurricane, this stage consists of preparing for the impact, boarding up homes and businesses, deciding whether to shelter in place or evacuate. Sometimes this decision is not a choice if the financial resources are not there to evacuate. When the disaster hits, homes are destroyed, businesses are destroyed, and lives are lost. In the heroic phase, immediately following the impact of the disaster, help starts pouring in the form of rescue missions, disaster response groups, and resources that are sent in to help take care of basic needs like food, shelter, clothing, and of course the financial resources. Electric companies pour in to restore power to the community, and the community comes together. People are in denial about the true impact of the disaster has had on their homes and families because of all the inpouring of resources. So then we go to the honeymoon phase. In the honeymoon phase of the disaster, people are over hopeful, still in denial about the true impact of the disaster. Survivors are thankful for all the assistance that has been given. People are overworking themselves in order to restore the community to some type of normalcy. People are overly optimistic. However, physical problems such as heart attacks are becoming more common. Survivors and the organizations offering assistance are being overworked and become mentally and physically drained. In the disillusionment phase, this phase is after the honeymoon phase. Outside resources begin to diminish. Local resources are beginning to struggle to keep up with the demand of the needs for the people and the community, and the reality starts to set in about how much work it's really going to take to rebuild their community and their homes. People start to feel hopeless, abandoned, angry, and fearful. This stage can last for years depending on the severity of the disaster. Mental health issues begin to be evident in the forms of PTSD, anxiety, depression, and suicides. The reconstruction phase, this is the last phase of the disaster. In the reconstruction phase, people begin to rebuild and adjust to a new normal. In this stage, there is post-traumatic growth. However, new problems arise due to financial struggles, addictions that have been developed through the other phases, marital problems, and mental health concerns. Having a disaster plan in place for the community can help alleviate some of the stress and financial burden that the disaster has on families and the community as a whole. So during Hurricane Katrina, many people couldn't afford to evacuate. Sadly, these were from lower income communities whose homes did not withstand the storm. Having a disaster plan in place ahead of time can ensure that people have a way to go out and a place to go in the wake of a natural disaster. According to Math, Nirmala, Morgantham, and Kumar, this can be understood on the basics of 6 R's. Okay, so the 6 R's are readiness or preparedness. So response and immediate action, relief, sustained rescue work, rehabilitation or long-term remedial measures using community resources, and recovery or returning to normalcy. The resilience strongly depends on these 6 R's. In the heroic phase of a disaster, you have much needed resources pouring in and offering assistance. Basic needs are being met. There's a tremendous amount of manpower and financial resources coming into the community to get it restored to where it can at least have the basic necessities need to begin functioning as a community again. Usually families will be relocated or sheltered If their homes were destroyed, local and neighboring churches offer meals, shelters, and worship to survivors. Government programs are handing out food cards and vouchers. Organizations like FEMA are coming in to offer their aid. During Hurricane Katrina, flood damage was concentrated in predominantly poor and Black communities with low quality housing. Because low income households are less likely to be able to prepare for disasters or have enough insurance to buffer their adverse effects, government assistance is a vital lifeline to these lower income residents. This is from Raker 2023. Mental health services are also needed in this phase because even though the community is receiving help, a disaster has impacted the community and lives have been lost. Homes have been lost, jobs have been lost, and survivors are mentally struggling to deal with the physical impacts of the disaster while also grieving for the losses they have experienced. Psychological first aid is not only needed for the survivors but also the helpers coming in. Being on a search and rescue team can cause severe psychological damage for someone who wasn't prepared for the conditions that they would encounter. The overwhelming sadness and grief that the community is experiencing can be contagious and impact the people offering assistance as well. Self-care needs to be of high importance to prevent burnout. This can be done by having recreational activities set up for stress relief at local churches or other businesses that weren't completely destroyed, um, and stressing the importance of taking time away from their mission to care for themselves. Survivors are more sensitive to spirituality at this stage, especially with all the Christian organizations that are pouring into the community to offer assistance. The importance of healthy coping skills is needed throughout this phase. And here we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So during this phase, we are just trying to accommodate the physiological needs, which is breathing, food, water, sleep, homeostasis, sorry. Um, all these other needs right now come next. Mental health is important in this phase too, um, but that's not going to come until people have food and shelter and they feel safe. The needs and challenges of the honeymoon phase. Survivors are feeling overly positive due to all the resources and support. They are still in denial about the long road ahead of them in rebuilding what has been destroyed. People are becoming exhausted, and the need to rest and self care are very important. In the honeymoon phase, resources and survivors are beginning to run out of funds, energy, and motivation. People are experiencing mental crashes, physical crashes, and heart attacks and other stress related illnesses are beginning to surface. In this phase, there is a rise of addictions and self destructive and maladaptive behaviors. Depression and PTSD can develop at any phase of a disaster. However, in the honeymoon phase, the initial excitement is gone and people are slowing down enough to allow these negative feelings to surface and take over. It is necessary to have mental health providers available to the survivors during this phase of a disaster to help them process through what they are experiencing and feeling and to offer healthy coping skills and ways to manage their emotions and their mental health. In this phase, the stress of the disaster can start having a negative impact on the family as a whole, whether it's stress related or whether the family member has turned to negative coping skills such as addiction. In this phase, local resources need to start planning for when the outside resources return home. So, in the disillusionment phase, reality begins to set in. According to Math, Nirmala, Morgantham, and Kumar, prevalence of mental health problems in a disaster affected population is found to be higher by 2 to 3 times that of the general population. In this phase, survivors start realizing the true impact of the disaster has had on them, and with outside resources diminishing, the reality of how much work and money it will take to rebuild sets in. Feelings of hopelessness, fear, and anger um, set in. It is in this phase where mental health services are needed the most. In this phase, survivors have developed PTSD, high levels of depression, anxiety, addictions have started to develop. Families are now suffering from not only the disaster impact, but also the added stressors like mental health and substance abuse disorders. Financial hardships are putting added stress on the family. In this stage, there's a high prevalence for suicides and suicide attempts. Survivors could benefit from religion and spiritual growth at this phase to help cope with the reality of their situation. While disasters often bring people closer to God, for some, a disaster can have the opposite effect. Survivors who have lost loved ones, children, or everything may become angry at God or lose faith altogether. The characteristics that they originally ascribed to God no longer make sense to them. This can create its own crisis. Counselors are needed to address survivors' anger issues with God. Giving them space to vent can give the counselor a good idea of how they originally viewed God's interactions in their life, and those underlying beliefs can then be further explored using techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy. This is from Collins 2021. Religious and spiritual forms of coping include prayer and personal meditation, reading in scriptures, um, engaging in individual or communal worship, and rituals of reaffirming the purpose of life. This is from Hong in 2019. So, in conclusion, during the different phases of disaster, the needs and challenges change for not only the survivors but the community as a whole. The road to recovery after a disaster strikes can feel like an emotional roller coaster ride, and unfortunately for some, that metaphorical roller coaster finally crashes. Mental health services are not the only need in a disaster crisis by far, but keeping survivors mentally healthy after a crisis is crucial to their resilience. A disaster also has an impact on the person's spirituality. With all the Christian based resources and assistance pouring in, survivors have an opportunity to reconnect with God or to go stronger in their faith. They can see the community coming together and they can pull the positives out of a disaster situation. This isn't always the case, though. For some, it leaves them questioning God and his motives. Spiritual counseling is needed at this time because of feelings of anger, resentment, and confusion towards God can leave someone feeling abandoned by the one who is supposed to protect and love you. Having mental health and spiritual counselors in a disaster is important at every post disaster phase to ensure resiliency. I want to thank you for listening today. Here's a list of the resources that I used in developing my presentation. Thank you.